at her. Then, without any warning, he shoved the door open with his shoulder, knocking it wide open and stepping inside. Karen recoiled in shock. She hadn't expected him to force his way in. "Get out of my house," she shouted, her voice now tinged with panic. Hale ignored her, his eyes scanning the room, as if looking for any reason to escalate the situation further. He took a few steps deeper into the house, his boots echoing loudly on the wooden floor. Karen quickly stepped in front of Jamal, her protective instincts kicking in. She wasn't going to let him hurt her son, not without a fight. "Officer, I'm asking you to leave now," Karen said, her voice firm but trembling with a mix of fear and anger. But Hale wasn't backing down. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes cold and filled with something that resembled contempt. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Hale sneered. "You think because you know the law, I'll just let you go on with your little life here, in your little house? You're not in charge here." The words stung, and Karen felt her heart race even faster. She had faced racism before, both subtle and overt, but this felt different. There was no escaping the power dynamic at play. He was a police officer, and she was just a black woman in her home. "I've asked you to leave," Karen repeated, now standing firmly between Hale. The camera's red light flickered on, and Karen felt her pulse quicken. She had been on TV before, but never for something like this. This wasn't a segment about a charity event or a community gathering. This was personal. The days after the interview passed in a blur of headlines, social media posts, and phone calls. Karen could barely keep up with everything. The moment she had spoken, her truth had launched a chain reaction, one that she couldn't have anticipated. But in the midst of it all, one thing was clear: she had done the right thing. She had stood up, spoken out, and her voice was being heard. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was the story of so many others who had been silenced by fear. The phone never seemed to stop ringing. News outlets continued to contact her for interviews, and organizations reached out, offering support. But it wasn't the media frenzy that kept Karen awake at night. It was the thought of what would come next. What would happen to Officer Hale? Would he face any consequences for his actions? Would the police department stand behind him, or would they finally hold him accountable? Karen didn't have all the answers, but she knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone silence her. She wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her or her son again. The night after the interview, Karen and Jamal sat together in the living room, just the two of them. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, despite the weight of everything that had happened. Jamal, who had been so scared in the days leading up to the confrontation, was beginning to find a sense of peace again. The tremors in his hands had stopped, and he no longer flinched at every noise. "Mom, I'm proud of you," Jamal said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He was sitting on the couch, his feet tucked underneath him. "You're really brave." Karen smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "You're proud of me? You're the brave one, baby," she said, reaching over to gently ruffle his hair. "You saw what happened, and you didn't run away. You stayed right here with me. That's bravery." Jamal's face lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't want you to be alone," he said, his eyes shining. "I wanted to help." "You did help," Karen replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You helped by staying strong. And that's all I could ever ask for." As they sat together, Karen thought about everything they had been through. The officer's violent behavior, the fear that had gripped her heart, the strength she had found when she needed it the most, all of it had led them to this moment. But even though she felt proud of what they had accomplished, Karen knew that their fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about what had happened to them, it was about the countless others who had experienced similar injustices, and who still lived in fear. A few days later, a meeting was arranged between Karen, her lawyer, and the police department. It was the first step in what was sure to be a long legal battle. The meeting took place in a small, sterile conference room, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Karen sat at the table, her lawyer beside her, with a sense of resolve in her chest. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. Officer Hale was present too, though he didn't make eye contact with her. He sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. There was a tension in the air, but Karen wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. She had already faced him once before, and now she was ready to do it again. "Miss Thompson," the police chief began, his voice low and measured. "We've conducted an internal review of the incident. Officer Hale has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation. We are taking this matter very seriously." Karen nodded but said nothing. She didn't trust their words. She had seen how the system worked, and she knew that actions spoke louder than any apology or promise of change. "What does that mean for him?" Karen asked, her voice steady. "Will he face any real consequences?" The police chief paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "The investigation is ongoing," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "We're reviewing all the evidence, including your statement and any video footage." Karen's lawyer spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "We expect transparency in this investigation. Miss Thompson and her son deserve justice for what happened to them." The conversation continued, but Karen's mind wasn't focused on the words being spoken. She knew they were trying to placate her, to make it seem like they were doing something. But she wasn't fooled. She had seen this play out too many times. This was just the beginning of a long and difficult process. After the meeting, Karen and her lawyer walked out of the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The air outside was cooler than it had been inside, and the bright sunlight felt like a contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of the police station. "Well, that went about as expected," her lawyer said, offering a half smile. "But don't worry. We've got this. We're going to keep fighting." Karen didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the sky, her thoughts drifting to the future. She knew this battle wouldn't be easy. It would take time, and there would be obstacles along the way. But she was prepared to fight. She wasn't just fighting for herself or Jamal. She was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person who had ever been silenced by fear. When they returned home, the phone was ringing again. This time, it was the news station, calling to follow up. "We want to keep updating our viewers on the situation," the reporter said. "Would you be willing to do another interview? People are rallying behind you, and your story is starting to make a real impact." Karen paused, looking down at Jamal, who was sitting on the couch, playing with his action figures. His face was calm, but she could tell that he had been thinking about everything that had happened. "Yes," Karen said, her voice firm. "I'll do the interview. I'll keep speaking out. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about everyone who's been treated like we have." And so, the story continued. Karen became a voice for those who had been silenced, a symbol of strength and resilience in the face of injustice. The journey was far from over, but with each step, she grew stronger. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Jamal by her side, and she had the support of so many others who were ready to stand with her. Together, they would keep fighting. And they would win. Raw. She was about to tell the world what had happened to her and her son. The news crew stood quietly, giving her the space to collect herself. Jamal, still holding her hand, was standing beside her, his small frame almost hidden behind her. His presence was a comfort, a reminder of why she was doing this. "Take a deep breath," the reporter, a woman named Sarah, said kindly. "Whenever you're ready, just start talking." Karen nodded, taking a deep breath. She had practiced what she wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, words felt more difficult to gather. She wasn't sure how long it would take to get through this, but she had to speak. For herself, for Jamal, and for everyone who had been silenced by fear. "Good evening," Karen began, her voice steady but soft. "My name is Karen Thompson. I'm a mother, a woman just trying to make a living and raise my son. But tonight, I'm here because something happened to us that no one should ever have to face." She paused, her chest tightening, but she kept going. "Tonight, Officer Richard Hale, a local police officer, came to my house. He didn't have a warrant, but he demanded to be let inside. When I refused, he got angry. And that's when it escalated." She took another breath, glancing down at Jamal, who was still staring at her, his big eyes filled with uncertainty. "Officer Hale shoved his way into my home. He didn't just knock, he barged in. And then he grabbed me by the throat," Karen continued, her voice steady despite the pain of remembering. "He squeezed so tight I couldn't breathe. And when my son tried to help me, he shoved him to the ground." There was a long silence. Sarah, the reporter, waited, giving Karen time to process the words she had just said. The camera was still on, capturing everything. Karen felt the weight of her words as they hung in the air, like the heaviest thing she had ever said. But she couldn't stop. She needed to keep going. "I thought I was going to die," Karen said quietly, almost to herself. "I thought this was the end. But I couldn't let it end like that. I couldn't let my son see that." Her voice shook for a moment, but she swallowed hard and pushed through. "So, I did what I had to do. I reached for something. I grabbed my late husband's rifle, the only thing I could think of to protect us." Sarah nodded, her face soft with understanding. "And that's when you took control of the situation?" Karen nodded in return. "Yes. I took control. I didn't want to. I never thought I'd have to do something like that. But I couldn't let him hurt us anymore. I pointed the rifle at him, and he backed off. He left. I don't know if he thought I was bluffing or what, but he left. And I'm here today because of that." The camera crew stood quietly, but Karen could feel the intensity of the moment. She wasn't just telling her story anymore, she was making it clear to everyone watching that she had fought back. She had refused to let fear control her, and now she was telling the world about the injustice that had almost cost her everything. Jamal tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Are we in trouble?" Karen knelt down in front of him, looking into his big brown eyes. He was still trembling slightly, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "No, baby," she said softly. "We're not in trouble. We're doing the right thing. We're telling the truth." Jamal didn't say anything more, but he gave her a small, uncertain nod. Karen knew he was scared. She was scared too. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense that she was doing something that mattered. She had to do this, not just for Jamal, but for everyone who had been hurt or silenced in the same way. The reporter gave her a moment to collect her thoughts before she asked the next question. "Karen, do you feel that you've been treated fairly by the police in your community? Do you think that Officer Hale's actions are part of a bigger problem?" Karen hesitated, her mind flashing back to the countless times she had been made to feel invisible, to feel like she didn't matter. She had always believed that she could keep her head down and avoid trouble, that if she just followed the rules, everything would be okay. But tonight had shattered that illusion. "No," Karen said quietly, but with conviction. "I don't feel safe. I don't feel like I can trust the people who are supposed to protect us. And that's not just about Officer Hale. It's bigger than that. It's a problem that runs deep. It's about people who are afraid to speak up because they know they'll be punished for it. It's about fear. Fear that someone will come into your home, that someone will hurt you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Her voice shook as she spoke, but she couldn't stop herself. The words had been building up inside her for so long, and now that she was saying them, they felt like they needed to be heard. This isn't just about one officer, Karen continued. This is about the system that allows this to happen. It's about the fact that people like me, people like my son, are treated differently. We don't have the same protections, the same rights. And that's not right. The reporter nodded, her expression solemn. So, you're calling for change? Yes, Karen said firmly. We need change. We need to make sure that no one else has to go through what I've gone through tonight. We need to stand up and demand that we be treated with dignity, with respect. Because we matter. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The camera crew nodded, acknowledging the weight of her statement. The interview had gone on longer than Karen had expected, but it felt like a release. She had spoken the truth, and now it was out there for everyone to hear. The reporter smiled gently, her eyes filled with empathy. Thank you, Karen, for sharing your story with us. We'll be following up on this, and we'll make sure your voice is heard. Karen nodded, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She was exhausted, but she was also proud. She had taken the first step toward making sure that what had happened to her would never happen again. She had spoken out. She had told her story, and now, she was ready for whatever came next. As the camera crew packed up, Karen stood up, looking down at Jamal. He was still holding her hand, his face a mix of awe and concern. Are you okay, Mom? He asked again, his voice soft. I'm okay, baby, she said, smiling down at him. We're going to be okay. They stood there together, a mother and son who had faced the worst and come out stronger. Whatever happened next, Karen knew one thing for sure, they would face it together. Nd Jamal. Her hands were clenched into fists by her sides, ready to do whatever she could to protect her son. The house felt eerily quiet after Officer Hale left. Karen stood frozen, still holding the rifle in her trembling hands, while Jamal clung to her like a lifeline. Her heart raced, her breath coming in uneven gasps, but she couldn't fully process what had just happened. It was as if everything had occurred in a blur of fear, adrenaline, and instinct. The room seemed to close in on her, and Karen realized her grip on the rifle was so tight that her knuckles had turned white. Slowly, she lowered it, her arms aching from the tension. She placed the weapon down on the coffee table, the weight of it no longer feeling like a protector but a reminder of just how close she had come to losing everything. Jamal stepped back, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. His face was pale, but he was trying to hold it together. Mom, are we okay? He asked, his voice small and uncertain. He was so brave, but Karen could see the fear still trembling in his eyes. Karen knelt down in front of him, pulling him into her arms. We're fine, baby, she said, trying to reassure him, though the words didn't quite have the same certainty she usually carried. We're okay. But deep down, she knew they weren't just fine. She had just stared down an officer, someone who was supposed to protect them, and made him retreat. She had taken control of the situation, but the truth was, she didn't know what would come next. Would Hale come back with reinforcements? Would he accuse her of something? What if this wasn't over? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the kitchen counter. She hadn't even noticed it earlier, but now it felt like a signal. Slowly, she stood up, holding Jamal's hand as they walked to the kitchen. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was a local news station. Karen hesitated for just a second before answering. Hello. Miss Thompson. A woman's voice on the other end was smooth but urgent. I'm with Channel 7 News. We've just received an anonymous tip about an incident involving a police officer at your address. Can you confirm that you were involved in a confrontation with Officer Hale tonight? Karen's heart skipped in her chest. Her first instinct was to deny everything, to protect herself and her son. But as she glanced at Jamal, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, his eyes wide with curiosity, something inside her shifted. She couldn't stay silent. Not now. Not after everything that had just happened. Yes, I was involved, Karen said, her voice steady but firm. But let me tell you the truth. Officer Hale came into my home without a warrant, tried to intimidate me, and attacked me. He put his hands around my throat and tried to hurt me and my son. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Karen could hear the woman's breath. Miss Thompson, are you saying that Officer Hale assaulted you in your own home? Yes, Karen said, her voice growing stronger with each word. He assaulted me. And he shoved my son to the ground when he tried to help me. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was an attack. The silence on the phone felt heavy, but Karen didn't back down. She needed to tell someone. She couldn't let this go unnoticed. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. We need to investigate this further, Miss Thompson. Would you be willing to speak on camera? We need to share your story. Karen looked over at Jamal, who was now staring at her, waiting for her next move. He had always been her strength, and now, in this moment, he was watching her, waiting to see how she would handle this. I'll speak, Karen said, her voice unwavering. I won't let this go. I won't let my son or myself live in fear. This needs to be exposed. The woman on the other end of the line agreed to send a camera crew over, and Karen hung up the phone. She felt a surge of mixed emotions. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else. Something stronger. A sense of resolve. Mom. Jamal said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, filled with uncertainty, but there was a quiet strength in it. What happens now? Karen turned to him, kneeling down in front of him once again. She wiped away his tears, even though her own eyes were starting to sting. She couldn't let him see her break down. Not now. Not after everything. Now, baby, she said, her voice steady, we take control of our story. We tell the truth. Jamal nodded, though he was still confused. Are we going to be okay? He asked again, the question lingering in the air. Yes, Jamal, Karen said, kissing the top of his head. We're going to be okay. We're going to make sure that no one ever does this to us again. As she stood up, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of power she hadn't known she was capable of. She had faced down an officer, someone who had the authority to harm her, and she had won. She had stood up for herself and her son. The thought that Hale might come back didn't scare her as much now. She was no longer the helpless woman trying to avoid conflict. She was someone who could make her voice heard. She was someone who would fight for justice. An hour later, Karen found herself standing outside her front door, looking at the news crew that had arrived. The camera was set up, the crew moving with professional speed, but it all felt surreal. Was she really about to speak out on camera? Was she really going to tell the world what had happened? Jamal stood beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. She squeezed his hand, offering him a smile. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about showing Jamal that no one could silence them. No one could take their dignity or their strength. The reporter gave her a gentle nod, and Karen took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was telling the world that she, and every person like her, had a right to be treated with respect. She was ready to speak up, to make sure that what had happened to her never happened again. The cameras started rolling. I'm Karen Thompson, she began, her voice steady and clear. And this is my truth. Hale's patience had clearly worn thin. He reached out suddenly and grabbed Karen by the throat, his grip tightening in an effort to silence her. The world seemed to spin for a moment as Karen gasped for air. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred, and her body fought against the crushing pressure. Karen's mind raced, but her body reacted instinctively. As Officer Hale's fingers tightened around her throat, she felt the world around her blur, like she was drowning. It wasn't the first time she had felt powerless in this world, but today was different. She had a choice to make. She had to protect her son, no matter the cost. For a split second, she felt as though she might lose consciousness. The pressure in her throat made her struggle for air. She tried to push against Hale's arm, but it was as if she were fighting against a wall. The cold, stern look in his eyes sent a chill through her body. He wasn't just physically overpowering her, he was trying to break her spirit. Jamal's cries rang in her ears, and it was the sound of his voice that gave her the strength she needed. She couldn't let him see her weak. She couldn't let him grow up thinking that fear and injustice would always win. Her body shook with the effort to breathe, but she pushed through the panic. Her hand reached for something. Anything. She couldn't give up. Her fingers brushed against something hard above her, a memory from a time before all of this began, a time when her late husband was still alive, when their lives were still peaceful. It was the Barrett M95, a weapon her husband had used when he served in the military. It had always been a symbol of his strength, and Karen had kept it hidden, away from view, as a reminder of his protective nature. With everything inside her, Karen forced herself to stand tall and reach for the rifle. She could feel the weight of it, heavy in her hands. It was her last chance. Without thinking about what she was doing, without fully processing the consequences, she yanked the rifle down from the mantel. The cold steel of the rifle seemed to pulse in her hands, as though it was alive, as though it was the only thing standing between her and her son's safety. She had never imagined she would be in a situation like this, but here she was, fighting for her life. And for Jamal's. Officer Hale was too caught up in his own anger to realize what was happening. He tightened his grip on Karen's throat, but then he froze. His eyes flickered down to the rifle in her hands. It wasn't just any gun. The Barrett M95 was a sniper rifle, known for its long-range precision and immense power. In the right hands, it could do serious damage. Hale's expression changed in an instant, from one of anger to shock. Karen's eyes locked onto his. The power had shifted. She didn't need to say anything. The rifle in her hands spoke louder than any words ever could. She was no longer just the black woman who had tried to stand up for herself. She was now in control of the situation. "Release me," Karen said, her voice surprisingly calm, though her heart was pounding. She wasn't sure if the command would be enough, but she was certain of one thing: she wasn't going to let him hurt her or Jamal any longer. For a long moment, Hale didn't move. He simply stared at her, his mind racing as he realized just how close he had come to making a grave mistake. The grip he had on her throat loosened, but he didn't let go completely. He stood there, his eyes darting between the rifle and Karen's face. The tension between them was thick. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Karen wasn't sure how much longer she could hold the rifle steady. Her hands were shaking, but she knew she couldn't falter now. She had already come too far. "I said let go," she repeated, her voice firm. Hale slowly, almost reluctantly, released his grip on her throat. She gasped for air, taking in deep breaths, trying to steady herself. Her vision slowly returned to normal, and she felt the strength returning to her body, though her legs were still weak. For a moment, the only sound in the room was her breathing and the faint sound of Jamal's sobs from behind her. He was still on the floor, his little body trembling with fear. Karen turned her head just enough to see him, and she could see the look in his eyes. He was terrified, but he was also watching his mother with wide-eyed awe. She knew that this moment would stay with him forever, just as it would stay with her. "Get out," Karen ordered Hale, her voice shaking but resolute. The rifle was still in her hands, aimed toward the floor, but she wasn't lowering it anytime soon. "I won't warn you again." Hale's face was pale, his eyes still fixed on the rifle in her hands. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but he stayed silent. His expression was no longer one of authority, instead, it was one of fear. He had come here with every intention of exerting his power over Karen, but now he was the one who was powerless. Slowly, Hale backed away, his eyes never leaving the rifle. He turned and walked toward the door, his boots making a dull thud against the floor. He didn't look back. As he stepped outside, Karen felt her shoulders relax for the first time in what felt like hours. But she wasn't done yet. This wasn't over. As the door slammed shut behind him, Karen turned back to Jamal, who had gotten up and was now standing a few feet away. His face was streaked with tears, but there was something else in his eyes, a mixture of confusion and understanding. "Are you okay, baby?" Karen asked softly, her voice trembling. Jamal nodded, though he was still shaking. He ran to her and wrapped his arms around her tightly. "Mom, you scared me," he whispered. "I know, baby. I know," Karen said, holding him close. "But we're okay now. We're safe." The relief she felt was overwhelming, but the fear and anger were still there, simmering just beneath the surface. She had stood up to an officer of the law, and she had won. But what would happen next? Would Hale report her? Would he come back with reinforcements? Karen didn't know, but she was certain of one thing: this wasn't just about what had happened in her home tonight. It was about something bigger, something deeper. Karen stood there for a long time, holding Jamal, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Her hand instinctively moved toward his wrist, trying to loosen his grip, but it was useless. Jamal screamed. "Let my mom go. Leave her alone." He tried to run toward them, but Hale shoved him aside with one hand, sending him crashing to the floor. The sight of her son hurt and frightened pushed Karen into overdrive. With every ounce of energy she had left, Karen mustered the strength to scream, "Get off me!" But it was barely more than a whisper against the suffocating hold. Hale's expression darkened even further, and just as Karen thought she might lose consciousness, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to die like this, not in front of her son. Not at the hands of this man. In that moment, Karen remembered something she had always kept out of sight but never truly forgotten: the rifle. The one her late husband had left behind. The one that could change everything. She knew what she had to do. She had no other choice.